Yeah, so if anyone was here, or not here, rather in Trainline 2 or 3 months ago, I can't remember, I gave pretty much this exact same talk. I've changed it a little bit. But if you did see it already, lucky you, get to see it twice. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, well, apologies if you've seen it already, but maybe it'll be a bit of a refresher, a chance for you to maybe thought of a question since the last time I gave the talk. But yeah, it's a little talk about writing better tests. This is in the context of React, because that's what I work with every day. And it's talking about React testing library. But actually, a lot of what I'm talking about here applies to testing anything, not just front-end components, but back-end. And it doesn't have to be React. If it's front-end, it could be anything. Yeah, a little introduction about myself. I'm Bill Mathews, or Billy sometimes. I've been a full-stack engineer for almost 8 years now. I did work for Trainline up until very recently. I no longer do. Yeah, so that's me. And yeah, as I said, I'm going to talk a little bit today about my opinion on how we can improve the tests that we write. Some disclaimers first, because I do advocate using the React testing library. Unfortunately, I'm not sponsored by them or affiliated with them in any way. It'd be awesome if I was, but sadly not. I'm by no means an expert. I actually don't use, or in my professional work, so where I'm working with companies or other teams, I haven't had the luxury of using React testing library in those environments yet. I don't know, it's just too new, too cutting edge. No one's got around to it yet. But so yeah, mostly I've been using like old enzyme tests for my React stuff professionally. In my spare time, I use React testing library. But sadly, there's less of my spare time than there is of my professional work. So I'm no expert, unfortunately. I'm just a big fan, basically. What is React testing library? For those of you who haven't heard of it, it's basically a really simple library for testing React components, purposely simple, and it tries to encourage better practices when writing your tests, basically. And its primary guiding principle is this. The more your tests resemble the way your software is used, the more confidence they can give you. An excerpt from this blog post, the link is being obscured, but you'll be able to find these slides after the talk on slides.com, so you'll be able to click these links. And I reference quite a lot of Kent's blog posts here because, or throughout these slides, because I think they're just really good. They're absolute gold, and the man's a genius, frankly. For those of you who don't know, this is the guy who thought up this library and wrote it and maintains it and does lots of writing on this sort of stuff. So if you don't know who he is, do look him up. So yeah, React testing library, simply in a nutshell, it gives us ways to query the DOM in the way that a user would. And that's important, I'll come on to that. But if you're familiar with Enzyme, this is basically a drop-in replacement for Enzyme. Worth mentioning as well, if you're a current user of Enzyme, you don't have to do a lift and shift, you don't have to rewrite all of your tests. You can install React testing library and write a new test with it and leave all your existing code as it is. So if you do want to get started, there's not really anything stopping you. And I just threw this in as well. This is a really super helpful cheat sheet when you're first getting started with React testing library to help you know the difference between get by, find by, query by, etc. So a link here if you're interested. And it comes with some custom matches for Jest just to make it a little bit more natural and declarative about the assertions that you're making. Just makes them easier to write, easier to read. I told you we're going to write better tests. What do we mean by better tests? What makes a test good? And to answer that question, I'm going to first ask another question. Why do we actually write tests in the first place? We like writing tests because they give us confidence in our product, basically. That's the main reason. We want to make sure it works at all times. And if we do an update, we want to make sure it still works. We know this, right? And so there's some things that we really don't like about tests as well. There's a learning curve a lot of the time. With some of the libraries, you need to know exactly what shallow versus mount is if you know what enzyme is. And there's a steep learning curve, or there can be. And we don't like spending a lot of effort writing our tests. And we especially don't like spending effort maintaining our tests. So if we make a small feature change, we don't want to have to spend some disproportionate amount of time because we had to rewrite all of our tests. So that's the things that we don't like about tests. At least in my experience, that's the things I don't like about tests. So consider this test. This is an example with enzyme. Actually, can I have a show of hands of who's used enzyme? Most of us, okay. And actually, out of interest as well, who has already used React Testing Library? That's awesome, really good. Okay, so most of us are already familiar with enzyme.
Why you didn't ask about Jest?
This is more about the tests themselves rather than Jest, which is just the test runner. Jest just runs your tests, right? I'd use anything to run my tests, I'm not too bothered. But this is more about the assertion libraries that we're using and the library to query the DOM or the React component or whatever we're querying. So yeah, we have a test here written with enzyme. And if you're not familiar, it's, without going into too much detail, it's a library for testing React components, and it allows you to render them in a few different ways. I mentioned shallow versus mount, and there's some differences there I won't go into. And then it lets you make assertions about basically the state of your React tree. So this test is asserting that an instance of a particular component exists. So it renders our to-do list, and it says to-do list instance.find to-do item. It's checking that that instance of to-do item component exists, and it asserts that the props are what we expect them to be. So we're expecting a text prop to be passed into that to-do item with the text that we passed in when we rendered the to-do list. So this probably looks pretty familiar, pretty standard enzyme test. I think we've probably all seen tests like this. So yeah, Kent has a great article called Testing Implementation Details. You'll probably guess what that's about. That's basically what this enzyme test is doing. This is the big problem here, is we're testing implementation details. And there's two distinct reasons why it's important to avoid, when you test your implementation details, your tests can break when you refactor your application's code, and that's a false negative. So you could refactor some code and everything's still working perfectly fine, but your test is broken just because it's coupled to the implementation of that test. So you've changed the implementation, test breaks, says everything's broken, but really it's all working fine. You don't want that, that's a waste of your time. And the inverse and opposite is that they actually might not fail when you do break your application's code. Because if you're testing some internal state of your component, and then in your render function you fail to render that state, and in your test you're checking, oh, well, the state's changed correctly, then actually your component isn't displaying the right thing to the user, but your tests are saying, well, everything's fine. Yeah, testing implementation details is not good. They lead to false negatives and false positives. And this is basically just echoing the same thing, but specifically pointing a finger at enzyme shallow rendering. And shallow rendering, yeah, it allows you to render a React component, but you only get back React components which are rendered as a result up to one level deep. So you don't get the full picture. And this is very tightly coupling your test to the component's implementation. If we think about the the to-do list example, that's rendering a to-do item component at the moment. Later on, we decide it's going to render something else, or we decide this is over-engineered, we're just going to render an LI, your tests break. Even though there's no need for that. So yeah, testing implementation details is not good. So what do we mean by implementation details? Which might seem kind of obvious, but there's more to it than you might think. So yeah, this is Kent's simple definition of an implementation detail is something which the users of your code will not typically use, see, or even know about. So anything that they do know about is not an implementation detail, and you should test that. And anything that they don't know about is an implementation detail, and you don't need to worry about testing that. In fact, you shouldn't test that. So then who is the user of the code? Again, another silly question. It's the end user that's trying to use your site or application, right? Actually, the next developer, so you've written a to-do list component, and the next developer to come along and they want to use that to-do list component, they are also a user of your code. They are interacting with the interface, which is the props that you're passing in the example of a React component. So yeah, Kent also has an article called Avoid the Test User, which is about that paradigm, which is another really interesting read. So yeah, your end user, you also have your developer user. We should be testing anything that the users are aware of, basically. The developer user is rendering the component with props, so we're testing that by writing a test where we pass in props to the component. as the input. Querying and interacting with the rendered result, that's the end user who is using your site. And it shouldn't include, as we said, any implementation details, so we shouldn't be making assertions around a component's internal state, or component names, or CSS classes or selectors, or anything that the users don't see. With all that said, let's see how we can write that previous test of the to-do list component a little bit better, in my opinion, with React Testing Library. So we're testing the exact same thing. We're testing that when we render this to-do list with these props, we expect there to be that text rendered on the page somewhere, basically. So it's a little bit different to Enzyme in that you actually destructure your queries from the result of the render. So we have a get by text, and get by text, I showed you that cheat sheet earlier, but get by text, so get expects 1. So if it finds 0 or more than 1, it will throw an error, which is why I don't have an expect there. In hindsight, that's a little bit confusing. So I might have passed the done parameter to the test and passed that into done, and that's maybe a little bit clearer. Or I could just put an expect there in for the hell of it, even though it does nothing, just to make it a bit more readable. But the point is, we're testing the same thing here, but we're not coupled to the component name, and we're not coupled to the props. We're just saying, testing. We're not coupled to the props in that we're not testing the props of child components. So we're passing in these props, and then we're saying, I want to find this text that I've passed in, I expect that to be on the page. So if we talk about what was going to break the Enzyme implementation, where we maybe refactor the to-do item to use it NLI or something else, this will still work. I can't remember the other example I had of breaking it, breaking the component and letting the test still pass. But I have more examples, so that's fine. The reason that I like React Testing Library so much is it's actually trying to encourage you to write tests with these best practices and writing tests that resemble how the components are used by the end user, as opposed to Enzyme, which is a little bit more of a free-for-all, and it gives you a lot of power to do absolutely anything you want. I read, I can't remember who this was by, it might actually have been by Kent as well, something about, you may have heard of a pit of despair, which is a big hole that you fall into and everything just goes wrong. Kent talks, it was Kent talking about this library, talking about making it a pit of success. So he wants you to fall into success. So even if you're not trying, you succeed. So that's what I like so much. And everything in the project tries to abide by these guiding principles. So if it relates to rendering components, then it should deal with DOM nodes rather than component instances, and it shouldn't encourage dealing with component instances. Again, this is coupling to implementation. The library should be generally useful for testing the application components in a way that the user would use it. We're making some trade-offs here, of course, because it's not a real user and it's often a simulated environment. But in general, you should encourage testing the components in the way that they're intended to be used. And the implementations should be simple and flexible. And I think they are, personally. So let's look at another slightly more complex example. This time it's an accordion component. Again, Enzyme first. Can anyone see what could go wrong here? There's quite a few things that could go wrong here, actually. It's very brittle, a very brittle test. So again, we're testing on internal state, and there's no reason why I might want to just rename that to something totally random like bananas, and then our test fails even though everything's still working totally fine. Our state's just called bananas. Or maybe if we want multiple accordion items to be open at once, then we change our state to be an array instead of a single index. Everything blows up in our tests, even though the component's still working fine. The React Testing Library version doesn't care about your implementation. It's only concerning itself with what we put into the component and what comes out of the component. The result is that this test won't fail no matter what you do to the implementation, as long as it still works, as long as when you pass in these items, you get the expected text, and when you click on a certain item, you see the expected content. So yeah, I would say that this test gives me a lot more confidence that it is actually testing what I want it to be testing, and that the user will be seeing the right thing. And I'm also not worried here about effort. I'm just going back to what we like and don't like about tests, which is confidence. This gives me confidence, and I don't like putting in effort. And I think this one was slightly easier to write and understand, and I know that this won't break, so there's much less maintenance there. Just because it's Christmas, I've given us one more example. It's a very short one, but I'm sure we're all thinking about advent calendars, even though we're not feeling that Christmassy. We all love an advent calendar. So we can see the same classic issues here. We've hard-coded the name of a component. Again, we might want to change that. In fact, 2 components. We've hard-coded the name of some text that we're passing to a child component. Sorry, of some props, not text. And yeah, so this one would quite easily break. So let's rewrite this with React Testing Library. So instead of hard-coding the door component on the advent calendar by name, so I've used get-by-text to find the door with the number 25 of it. Obviously, I'm not doing them in order. Everyone goes for 25 first, right? So I found it by the text. I've said there should be a 25 on here somewhere. And if I click on that, well, there should be no chocolates before. And then I click on the number 25, and I expect there to be a chocolate visible. I've used query by alt text because I'm assuming we're using an image to display a nice chocolate. So yeah, that's it. It's a pretty solid test if you ask me. So to recap, React Testing Library, it's a library for querying the DOM in your tests, or a DOM. It could be a virtual DOM, it could be a real DOM. You can use this in the browser, it could be a JS DOM. It is a replacement for Enzyme. You could use it side by side in the same code base. I wouldn't know why you would want to use them in the same test, but they can be used in the same code base at the same time. And it helps us have confidence in our code and our tests, and it reduces the cost of writing and maintaining those tests, which actually I think is really important as well. I don't know who else feels the same way as me, but I find that a lot of the time I've spent more time writing a test than I have the actual component itself. And I feel like sometimes it's not worth the value it brings. So this helps with that. And as I said, when you have to write a new feature and all your tests become invalid and you have to rewrite them, that sucks. Helps us do those things by providing some really simple APIs and encouraging best practices and actually making it into a pit of success where it's actually hard to go wrong. And finally, remember, the more your tests resemble the way your software is used, the more confidence they can give you. If there's one thing to take away, it is that one. Thank you. Any questions?
Yeah, maybe for those that we are still using Enzyme, do you think we can use Enzyme in a way that resembles React?
That's a really good question. I should have brought that up. Yes, as I said right at the beginning, everything I've talked about here can apply not just to React components. There's actually a testing library, and this is React testing library. So there's one for various other frameworks like Angular and Vue, I think. But actually this applies to, this is more of a way of thinking. So think about anything that you're testing as a black box, and you want to test the input and the output, and anything inside that is implementation, and you shouldn't care about testing that. So you can write your Enzyme tests in a way that's similar to that, and that'd be awesome. And similarly, you could test anything with keeping those sort of things in mind. Yes.
You said before that nothing should stop you to start using React Test Library on your project because you can run it with Enzyme.
Yep.
But at the same time, you say that you were not using it in your professional project.
So what actually stops you to do it?
That's a good question as well. Obviously, these aren't like my projects, so I don't have the full say. Sometimes I haven't felt like I personally have had the bandwidth to try and make that happen, and talk to the other people. In other cases, other people haven't been that receptive of it. That's probably my fault for not talking about it in the right way or something. But generally, one of those two reasons: either the team I'm working with don't really want it, or you've also got to be able to say, well, it's going to take this long, and the business you might be working for might say, well, what value does that bring us, and is it worth the time, that sort of thing. So it's always difficult trying to bring something new in like that into a business. Yes.
How do you test animations?
How do I test what, sorry?
Animations, things that change over time.
Animations. That's a good question, which I can't really answer. I totally can't answer that. But the only thing that does spring to mind for that question is generally you don't want to test external libraries, right? So it's a bit of a scapegoat question, but I would say I'd probably be using an external library for my animations, and therefore I wouldn't want to test it. And yeah, if I'm not using, to be honest, for a lot of the animations I do, I tend to try and steer towards CSS, and I'm not really testing that, I guess. But that's a good question. I'm sorry I can't answer it.
Cool.
Cool.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you.